Hi, this is Dale Cody. Welcome to another tutorial from DharmaPharm. Today we're going to work on a photograph I took for a real estate project I was working on. And this time it's a room. We're going to use Photoshop to make some improvements to this photo. And also one of my favorite new plugins. It's not free, but it's an awesome plugin. And if you haven't used it before, I think you're going to like it quite a bit. So let me point out a few things before we get started on what I think I'd like to improve in this photograph. So overall, the photograph isn't too bad. It's a little dark in some areas, a little too light in other areas. The saturation, the color saturation is kind of drab, but we could improve that quite a bit. There are definitely some issues here and there. One of the other big things is that some of the verticals, because of lens distortion at the far left and far right of the picture, are not vertical. So these window frames, although they should be vertical in the picture, they're not. That's a lens distortion issue from the camera that I used. There are some photographic filters we can use to work on that, lens correction filters, but I found that the end results aren't quite as satisfactory as I'd like. So I'm going to show you maybe another technique that you might use for this kind of photograph and some others. It doesn't work in all circumstances, but it is a handy tool to have in your toolbox. So anyways, let's get started. Here's the original image. Here's the image that we're looking to work on. So we're looking for a result something like this: brighter, more saturated. The verticals aren't quite as extreme. There are some issues around that, but we could fix that in another tutorial. So anyways, let's go ahead and get started on this one. So I'm going to duplicate the background by pressing Command or Control J to duplicate that. I'm going to hide the original background, and then usually one of the first things I do with almost any photographic image is I want to adjust the levels. So I'm going to press Control or Command L, and it'll bring up the dialog box. And on this particular image, I'm going to move this right slider quite a ways to the left to brighten up that image quite a bit. On this one, I look at the histogram. I really don't need to move that left one much. I really don't want to make that much darker in there. Maybe, by 1 or 2, that's about it. I'm going to leave this about where it is. I think it's good right at that one level. So I'm going to press OK, and we're going to accept that change. The next thing we're going to work on is we're going to work on the light in this window. It's too blown out. It's out of gamut. So I'm going to go here to Filter, and I'm going to go to the Camera Raw filter. That's fairly new in Photoshop, and it allows us to do the same sorts of manipulations with JPEG and other images that we used to be confined to only on Camera Raw images. So this is a really nice tool to have in the box. So if you look at the histogram, you'll see, well, it's easier to see actually on the red here. That means that white of that window is just completely blown out. We're out of gamut. So we want to fix that. There's a little bit on the floor as well. I could fix that through the exposure, but on this particular image, I think a better solution would be to move this highlight slider a little bit to the left, and you'll see that those red masks disappear. That means we're back in gamut. Now the blue indicates that the black is out of gamut, but it's kind of minimal. I don't think we really need to worry about it in this particular image, so I'm just going to leave it for now. One thing I am going to do though is, if you'll notice, if you zoom in on this image and then by Control Plus, and then hold that space bar down and pan, you'll see that there's some purple fringing here and there around the windows, and that's fairly common in an image of this type. So an easy fix for that is I'm going to go here to the Lens Corrections tab on the Camera Raw filter, and I'm just going to move this purple slider a little bit to the right till I get what I want. You'll see that those start to disappear, and I'm not going to take it too far, and then I'm going to commit to that. So I'm going to press OK to commit to that, and that's quite a bit better. So the next thing that we're going to work on is we're going to work on these perspective problems here, so that we want to make these vertical windows appear vertical in the middle of the picture where there's less lens distortion. They are pretty vertical, but here at the sides, they're pretty slanted. So one thing that I've done before is I've dragged some guides out from the left and right that will help us sort of just find those right spots. So I'm going to use these guides to sort of help define this. The way that I'm going to work on this is I'm going to press Edit, and I'm going to come down here to Perspective Warp, and I'm going to draw out a grid, and I want to cover that whole image. So I'm just going to zoom out a little bit, and I'm going to use the Shift key, and I'm just going to drag that grid so that it covers the entire image. You want to make sure that it covers the entire image so that it affects the entire image in this. It's not so critical that it goes way far over, just so long as you're in fact covering the whole image. So once I have that grid set where I want it, I'm going to click the warp button top left here, and then we're going to actually make the perspective warp. So holding on the Shift key, I'm going to pull that pin over, and I'm going to drag it to the right a little bit here until I get that left window frame looking more or less vertical. I don't want to overdo it, that's for sure, because it is going to cause some problems that we'll have to fix later on. And then I'm going to do the same thing on this right top pin. I'm just going to shift click drag it over to the right, get it about where I want it so that that fireplace line is roughly vertical. And when I get it about where I want it, I would spend some time, I would, doodling this, just getting it exactly where I want it. But we're just going to commit to that. So I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to press enter to commit to that. And you'll see that it has caused some problems. So the big problem here, the obvious one, is that there's some transparent pixels here on the left and the right. I could just crop this picture to fix that, and then I'd have a smaller picture, less pixel resolution to work with. So instead of that, I'm going to try a different kind of fix. And let's hide those guides to make this a little bit easier to see. So I'm going to press Control or Command H to hide those guides. And then what I'm going to do to fix these is not use the clone stamp tool. I'm not going to use the content aware fill or anything like that. I'm going to try something a little different that I think works generally pretty well. Not in all circumstances, but not too bad here. So first of all, rather than on this right side then affect the entire image, I'm just going to draw a marquee with the rectangular marquee tool to cover that part of the image because it's just a solid color. And then I'm going to go into edit, and I'm going to click content aware scale, and I'm going to just drag this off to the right. Press Command. Now that won't work in all circumstances. I'm going to press Command D to remove that. It definitely won't work in all circumstances, but because I have a solid color there, it does work fairly well. Now the left is a little bit different. If I did the same thing on the left, I would create some distortions that I really don't want to have. So rather than just selecting a part of that image, I'm going to select the entire image, but I'm also going to go to content aware scale, and then I'm just going to drag that over to the left so it just covers the image area. And I've got a little bit on the top and bottom. I'm just going to do the same thing with that. Just going to move those up and down a teeny little bit until I get it where I want it. Press enter to commit to that. And you'll see that it's much better. Now I've got a pretty large area of dark here. There are ways around that, but they take a little bit of time, so we're not going to go through that in this particular one. But the main thing is this is straight. There is a little bit of curvature here. There is some distortion, but less than if I had done the whole picture on the right. You'd see a lot more distortion here on this fireplace and on this wall. So there are some distortion issues, but they're minimized compared to what they could potentially be. So overall, it's fairly satisfactory, not ideal, but for the purposes of this exercise, I think you get the idea. So let's just make this a little bit larger. I'm going to press Command 0 rather, to fill the frame here. The next thing I want to do is I want to sharpen the image a little bit. It's a little bit dull in some areas, and then I want to increase and enhance the tonal contrast and just add a little bit more saturation to the image. And that's where the plugin, the Nik Collection plugin, comes in. There are tools in Photoshop that allow you to do this, but I want to show you a different way. And I think in some respects, the Nik Collection is a little bit more powerful, a little bit more easy to use, perhaps a little bit more intuitive. But anyways, let's get started on that one. So I'm going to go to Filter, and I'm going to go down to the Nik Collection, which I have installed already. And I'm going to click Output Sharpener. And that's going to bring up a dialog box. And that dialog box has a thumbnail at the bottom right here, you can see, with a little red square in it, a little red bordered square, and that little red bordered square shows in close-up form what the changes look like. So anything to the right of this red line here is what's going to be changed, what's going to be affected by the sharpening that I effect on this, and anything to the left is the original image. So you can see it's a great tool to compare the right side versus the left side. And I can adjust controls, however I want for each individual photographic circumstance that we're looking for. From prior working on this photograph, I found that the marks we have now, the adaptive sharpening at 36%, works quite well. So rather than messing around with it, I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm just going to commit to that, so I'm going to click OK. Now I'll sharpen that image up a little bit, not too much. If you over sharpen the image, what will happen is you'll introduce a little bit much grain to the photo, and so what you'll gain in terms of sharpness, you'll lose in other areas like noise and grain. So you don't want to do that too much. You want to be very judicious in that. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the filter again, and I'm going to go down to Knit Collection again, only this time I'm going to click the Color Effects Pro 4, and that's going to allow me to adjust the tonal contrast and the saturation. The Knit collection is very powerful. I can stack filters one on top of the other. You can see on the left of the screen here, there's many filters to choose from. You can be stacked and adjusted individually. For the purposes of this particular exercise, we're only going to adjust the tonal contrast range and the saturation. This one's a little bit different than the last filter in that everything to the right of this red line, which I can drag back and forth, is what's going to be affected by the filter, by the changes that I make. Everything to the left is the original image. And this is a really nice feature, so I can actually, in real time, visually compare and contrast, the changes that I'm making and versus the original, and commit to those. So I've looked at this already. This is again, it comes up with the control points I had last, and I've already gone through this image, and I found that these values of saturation, midtones, and shadows are about where I want them. Saturation is kind of fun. You can almost mimic HDR effects by just cranking that up, but it's pretty scary in an image like this. And so unless I was looking for that kind of effect specifically, I wouldn't do that. I would be very judicious with the saturation, as I would in any Photoshop filter. There are better ways of getting an HDR type effect than this, but just so you know that it's there, it is available. So when I get it where I want it, I'm going to click OK to commit to that. And it takes a minute or so. What it does, what the Knit collection does, it's kind of interesting, is it creates new layers for each time it's instantiated. And it doesn't always do that, but it does do it most of the time. Not always, but most of the time. So you'll get new layers for that. And it gives you kind of a history, and you can sort of play around with that. So there are some other things I could do to this photograph. I would potentially use the healing brush to move some of the spots out of the floor here. They're not so much imperfections as they're just things in the floor that sort of look like spots. And I would probably remove some of those. But at any rate, for the purposes of this exercise, I think we've got this image about where we want it for now. So let's compare and contrast the original with the fixed image. So here's the original. You can see that it's a little more drab. It's not quite as saturated, as vibrant. Those vertical lines on the windows on the left and the fireplace on the right are not vertical at all. They're really quite skewed. And then here's the fixed image. You could take it a little bit farther than that if you'd like, but I think this is a good compromise. So if you wanted to do the eye doctor eye chart sort of thing, we could do that before, after. So after, before, after, before. I like the result quite a bit in the after. I think it's a lot more happy, vibrant, saleable picture. I think it makes the room look a lot more inviting. So if you were using this for your own project, selling your own home or for a client, I think this would be a lot more inviting, appealing sort of photograph for that kind of purpose. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed the demo, and I look forward to talking to you in the next one. Thanks a lot. All right, bye-bye.